My daughter-in-law planned my funeral. I planned her foreclosure. I'm Frank Morrison, 72 years old, and I just learned something about my family that changed everything. My daughter-in-law thought she was throwing out the trash when she planned to throw me out. She had no idea she was about to lose everything she'd married into. See, Jessica made one critical mistake. She confused quiet with weak. And in Virginia Beach, where military honor runs deeper than country club memberships, that's a miscalculation that costs more than money. 3 days before Christmas, I overheard her whispering to my son Tommy about options for the old man. She didn't know I was standing right outside their bedroom door, or that her whispered words would cost her everything she thought she'd gained through marriage. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from, especially if you've ever been underestimated because of how you look or where you come from. This story starts with that conversation, when I realized respect isn't something you inherit, it's something you earn. The first time Jessica showed her true colors was at the Hampton Roads Country Club's Thanksgiving dinner. I'd worn my best shirt, a clean blue button-down I'd pressed myself, and my only pair of dress pants. Nothing fancy, but clean and respectful. Jessica took one look at me and sighed loud enough for the Miller family to hear. "Frank, couldn't you have worn something more appropriate?" She adjusted her $300 Hermes handbag like it was armor against embarrassment. "This is appropriate," I said quietly. "It's clean, pressed, and respectful." "Respectful?" She laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "Frank, this is the country club. People notice things." What people noticed was her correcting my grammar in front of the Andersons. When I mentioned me and Tommy working on his car, she interrupted with theatrical patience. "Tommy and I, Frank. Subject pronoun," like I was a slow child instead of the man who raised her husband. But the worst came when Colonel Hayes walked past our table. I started to stand, old Marine habit when you see a superior officer, but Jessica grabbed my arm. "Don't," she hissed. "You'll just draw attention." Colonel Hayes nodded politely and moved on. Jessica didn't see the slight confusion in her eyes or the way she glanced back at me twice. She was too busy smoothing over what she saw as my embarrassing behavior. "Frank, I know you mean well," Jessica continued, cutting her prime rib with surgical precision. "But Tommy's career is really taking off at Hampton Defense Systems. Image matters in his position." Tommy shifted uncomfortably, fork halfway to his mouth. "Jess, Dad's not—" "I'm just saying," she interrupted, "that some people judge books by their covers. Fair or not, that's reality in professional circles." I watched my son's face go red. 20 years I'd spent teaching him to stand up for what's right, and here he was, letting his wife reshape that lesson into something unrecognizable. "What exactly are you suggesting, Jessica?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Nothing dramatic, just awareness. Tommy's up for senior project manager. These things matter." The second incident happened just last week, December 15th, when she found me in my workshop behind the house. I was adjusting the carburetor on my 1987 Ford pickup. Nothing special, just keeping it running smooth. Jessica appeared in the doorway like she was entering a cave. "Frank, we need to talk about Christmas arrangements." I wiped my hands on the shop rag I've had for 15 years. "What arrangements?" "Well, Tommy and I have been discussing your situation. This house is getting too much for you to handle alone." "Seems fine to me." She picked her way around oil stains like they might jump onto her designer boots. "Frank, be realistic. You're 72 years old. The stairs, the maintenance, the isolation out here. It's not healthy. I maintain this place just fine. Do you?" She gestured at the workshop walls, covered with my tools, military photos, and yes, some oil stains from 40 years of honest work. Because from where I'm standing, this looks like a man holding on to something he should let go. That's when she said it, the words that showed me exactly who she was. Tommy deserves better than worrying about whether his father can manage basic self-care. We all do. I set down my wrench carefully. When you've been in combat, you learn to recognize the difference between someone who's testing boundaries and someone who's crossed them. Jessica had just crossed them. "And what would better look like, Jessica?" She smiled then, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Options, Frank. There are excellent facilities in Norfolk, places where you'd have professional care, social activities with people your own age. Think how much easier that would make things for everyone. Everyone. Like I was a burden being distributed among family members, instead of the man who'd built the foundation they were all standing on. I nodded slowly. I'll think about it. But what I was really thinking about was how wrong she was about who held the power in this family. She was about to find out just how wrong. Losing the house would hurt. Losing my son's respect would wound. But watching my grandson learn that disrespect pays, that would destroy everything I fought for in 3 tours of Vietnam. Let me explain what Jessica didn't understand about stakes. This house, the one she was so eager to help me let go, sits on land my father bought in 1953 with his Navy discharge pay. $47,000, which was serious money back then. The deed sits in my office safe, along with other documents Jessica had never seen. But it wasn't about the property value, though $600,000 in today's market isn't nothing. It was about what this place represented. Every board I'd replaced, every coat of paint, every upgrade, 40 years of sweat equity that proves something simple. Persistence beats privilege every time. When Tommy was 12, we built his treehouse in the backyard oak. Took us 3 weekends, working dawn to dusk with lumber from the hardware store and plans we drew on graph paper. That treehouse taught him that anything worth having is worth building yourself. Now Jessica wanted to teach him the opposite, that family becomes disposable when it's inconvenient. Dad, maybe we should just hear her out, Tommy had said yesterday, standing in that same backyard where we'd built something together. Some of these assisted living places are really nice. And expensive, I'd pointed out. We'll figure out the money, Dad. That's not your worry. But that was exactly my worry. Tommy made decent money at Hampton Defense Systems, $85,000 as a mid-level project coordinator. Jessica's part-time marketing job brought in maybe $30,000. Their mortgage on the newer house was $2,800 monthly. Add car payments, her shopping habits, and the country club membership she insisted on, and they were stretched thin. Now thin enough that the $2,200 monthly cost of Sunset Manor, the excellent facility Jessica had researched, would break them, which meant my Veterans Affairs benefits and Social Security would be expected to cover it. All $1,850 monthly. Simple math showed the gap. $350 monthly they couldn't afford, paid for with my independence. But there were bigger stakes than money. My grandson Jake, Tommy's 8-year-old, had been asking questions. Why does Mom say Grandpa Frank talks funny? Why can't Grandpa come to my school events? Is Grandpa poor? 8 years old and already learning to measure people by Jessica's standards instead of their character. Last month, Jake had asked if he could come work in my shop. Mom says it's too dirty, he'd told me, but I want to learn how to fix things like you. That boy needed to understand that working with your hands isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. But Jessica was systematically undermining that lesson, replacing it with her belief that worth equals wealth and dignity depends on designer labels. If I let her win, if I quietly accepted her options and disappeared into assisted living, what would that teach Jake about standing up for yourself? About the value of quiet strength over loud entitlement? Worse, what would it teach Tommy? My son was watching this whole situation, torn between loyalty and ambition. If he chose Jessica's path, if he learned that convenience trumps character, I'd lose more than my home. I'd lose the man I'd raised him to be. The real stakes weren't about where I'd live or how much money I'd spend. They were about whether 3 generations of Morrison men would stand for something or fall for anything. And there was one more thing Jessica didn't know about stakes. Sometimes, when you bet everything on the wrong horse, you lose more than you ever imagined you had. See, Jessica thought she held all the cards. She thought my quiet acceptance of her criticism meant weakness. She thought my simple lifestyle meant limited options. She was about to learn the difference between keeping a low profile and having nothing to show. The question wasn't whether I could afford to fight back. The question was whether she could afford for me to. The confrontation started on December 19th, over something as simple as Christmas dinner plans. Frank, we need to discuss logistics, Jessica announced, standing in my kitchen like she owned it. She'd let herself in through the back door, a habit that was starting to irritate me. What logistics? Christmas dinner. Tommy and I think it would be better if we hosted this year. More space, better kitchen, you know. I poured myself coffee from the pot I'd made at 0600, same time every morning for 40 years. This kitchen's hosted Christmas dinner just fine for 2 decades. That was different. Different how? She sighed like she was explaining basic math to a child. Frank, you're getting older. Cooking for a crowd, all that standing, the cleanup, it's a lot. I've handled bigger crowds than 6 people. Have you? When? The question hung in the air like smoke. She honestly didn't know. Tommy had never told her about the battalion reunions I'd hosted, the charity dinners for wounded veterans, the times this kitchen had fed 30 Marines and their families. I manage, I said simply. Frank, maybe it's time you stopped managing and started accepting help. That's when Tommy walked in, timing perfect for maximum awkwardness. Hey, Dad. Jess? Everything okay? We're discussing Christmas, Jessica said, her voice brightening artificially. I was just explaining why our place makes more sense this year. Tommy looked between us, reading the tension. Dad, what do you think? I think Christmas dinner stays here, like always. Frank, be reasonable, Jessica snapped, her patience evaporating. Your stove is from 1995. Your dishes don't match. You don't even have proper serving platters. The food tastes the same. It's not about taste. It's about presentation. About creating the right atmosphere for family. Right atmosphere for who? For everyone. For Jake, so he sees how holidays should be done. For Tommy's career, Colonel Hayes and her husband might stop by, remember? There it was, the real reason. Jessica wanted to show off, and my simple dining room didn't match her vision of impressive. Colonel Hayes is welcome here any time, I said. Frank, please, look around. She gestured at my kitchen like it was evidence in a trial. Formica countertops, linoleum floors, appliances older than my marriage. This isn't where you entertain people who matter. Tommy winced. Jess, that's honest, she interrupted. Frank, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings. I'm trying to help you see reality. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate calm. What reality is that? That times change, that standards exist for reasons, that sometimes loving someone means accepting their limitations. Whose limitations are we discussing? Her voice went sharp, patience finally snapping. Yours, Frank? Your limitations. This house, your clothes, your perspective. It's all stuck in the past. Which past? The past where you think simple is sufficient. Where you think effort matters more than results. Where you believe good intentions excuse outdated standards. Tommy stepped forward. Okay, maybe we should... No, I said quietly. Let her finish. Jessica crossed her arms, defiant now that she'd started. Fine. You want honesty? Here's honesty. Tommy is moving up in the world. His colleagues are educated, sophisticated people with expectations. When they meet his family, they form impressions. Fair or not, those impressions affect his opportunities. And I hurt his opportunities. You could help them, if you wanted to. How? By recognizing that your way isn't the only way. By accepting that maybe, just maybe, some situations require more than you can provide. The kitchen went quiet, except for the hum of my ancient refrigerator, another piece of outdated equipment in Jessica's view. More than I can provide, I repeated. Frank, I know this is hard to hear, but Tommy deserves support that matches his ambitions. Jake deserves to see excellence, not just adequacy. Adequacy. Yes, there's nothing wrong with adequacy, but there's everything right with excellence. And sometimes, excellence means knowing when to step aside. Tommy's face had gone red. Jesus, Jess, what are you saying? I'm saying that loving someone sometimes means wanting better for them than they want for themselves. I nodded slowly, like I was considering her words. Better. Better circumstances. Better opportunities. Better futures. For who? For everyone. For Tommy's career, for Jake's development, For your own comfort and dignity. My dignity. Frank, there's no shame in accepting help. There's no shame in admitting that some things are beyond your current capacity. I looked at my son, whose face showed exactly what this conversation was costing him. Then I looked at Jessica, who seemed to think she'd made a compelling case for my voluntary exile. You know what, Jessica? You're absolutely right. Her eyes brightened with surprise and victory. I am? Some things are beyond current capacity. Tommy relaxed slightly. The question is, I continued, whose capacity we're really discussing. And that's when I smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, borrowed from Jessica's own playbook. Christmas dinner stays here, like always. The phone calls started the next morning, December 20th, right at 07:30. I was finishing my second cup of coffee when the landline rang. The official number I keep for business, not the casual line Jessica uses to let herself into my life. Mr. Morrison, this is Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, Pentagon Procurement Office. Do you have a secure line for a brief discussion about Contract Alpha 779? Hold one, I said, walking to my office and closing the door. The secure phone sat in the locked drawer beside my desk, right next to documents Jessica had never seen. Alpha 779 confirmed, I said into the encrypted handset. What's the situation, Colonel? Sir, we're accelerating the timeline on the vehicle armor upgrades. Defense Secretary wants preliminary specs by January 15th instead of March. Can your team deliver? I glanced at the patent certificates on my wall, 18 of them, covering everything from blast-resistant steel composition to shock absorption systems. Patents that generated $680,000 annually in licensing fees alone. Affirmative. I'll have the preliminary designs ready by January 10th. Outstanding, sir. And Mr. Morrison, the Secretary specifically requested your personal oversight on this project. Something about your unique understanding of field requirements. 3 tours in Vietnam had taught me exactly what vehicles needed to survive in hostile territory. That knowledge had translated into innovations worth millions, innovations the Pentagon couldn't get anywhere else. Tell the Secretary I'm honored by his confidence. Will do, sir. Secure line closing. The call ended just as Tommy knocked on my office door. Dad, everything okay? Thought I heard voices. Business call, I said, locking the secure phone back in its drawer. Nothing urgent. Tommy glanced around my office, really looked at it, maybe for the first time in years. His eyes caught the framed photos I'd never bothered explaining. Me shaking hands with 4-star generals, receiving commendations at Pentagon ceremonies, standing beside prototype vehicles, bearing my patented armor systems. Dad, who's that in the photo with General Martinez? Old friend from the Corps. And this one with the Defense Secretary. Awards ceremony, few years back. He picked up a document from my desk, a quarterly report from Morrison Defense Solutions, showing contract revenues that would have made his eyes water if he'd understood what he was looking at. Morrison Defense Solutions? Dad, what is this? Consulting work. Keeps me busy. The phone rang again before he could ask more questions. This time it was my accountant, calling about quarterly tax estimates on patent royalties. I let it go to voicemail, but Tommy heard enough to look confused. Patent royalties? Few things I developed over the years, nothing major. But it was major. 18 patents covering vehicle protection systems, each one licensed to defense contractors worldwide. The quarterly check from Hampton Defense Systems alone was $47,000, more than Tommy made in 6 months for technology his own company depended on. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every day, Tommy went to work building vehicles that used my innovations, managing projects that existed because of my designs, reporting to supervisors who owed their contracts to my patents. He just didn't know it. Dad, how long have you been doing consulting work? Since I retired from active duty. Seemed wasteful to let all that experience go unused. Another phone call, this one from Norfolk Naval Base. Mr. Morrison, Admiral Richardson's office. The Admiral wants to confirm your attendance at the January procurement review. Will you be bringing your technical team? Just me, Admiral. I work better solo. Understood, sir. Security will have your clearance ready. Tommy's eyes went wide. Security clearance? Some contracts require background checks, standard procedure. What I didn't mention was that my clearance was TSS-SCI, top secret with sensitive compartmented information access. The kind of clearance reserved for people working on projects that could change the balance of military power. The kind of clearance that came with serious responsibility and serious money. Jessica thought she understood power, the kind that came from country club memberships and designer handbags. But real power was quieter than that. Real power was the Pentagon calling you sir and meaning it. Real power was holding patents that kept American soldiers alive. Real power was having options your enemies couldn't imagine. And Jessica? She was about to become my enemy. The country club Christmas gala on December 23rd was where Jessica decided to make her statement public. She'd spent the afternoon getting ready. Hair appointment at 2 p.m., nails at 4 p.m., the kind of preparation that treats social events like military campaigns. I'd put on my best suit, the navy blue one I kept for formal occasions, with the tie Tommy had given me 3 Christmases ago. "Frank, you look very nice," Tommy said when I met them at the club entrance. He meant it, though I caught him glancing nervously at Jessica's expression. Jessica wore a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, paired with jewelry that caught the light like small spotlights. She looked beautiful and expensive, exactly the image she'd been crafting since she married into the family. "Shall we?" she said, leading us toward the main dining room where the gala was already in full swing. The Hampton Roads Country Club Christmas Gala was serious business in Virginia Beach social circles. All the defense contractor families attended, along with military leadership, local politicians, and anyone else who mattered in the regional power structure. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, and conversations that determined million-dollar contracts over prime rib and political donations. We'd barely found our assigned table when Jessica began her performance. "Oh, look," she said, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "There's Colonel Hayes. Tommy, we should definitely introduce ourselves properly this time." Colonel Hayes sat 3 tables away with her husband, a distinguished-looking civilian who worked in defense procurement. Jessica had been angling for an introduction since Tommy started at Hampton Defense Systems, seeing the colonel as a networking goldmine. "Jessica, maybe we should just enjoy dinner," Tommy suggested. "Nonsense. This is exactly the kind of opportunity your father doesn't understand." She glanced at me meaningfully. "Some people think social events are just social. Others understand their professional investments." The barb was subtle but clear. I was the some people who didn't understand how the game was played. As the evening progressed, Jessica's comments became less subtle and more pointed. When the conversation turned to holiday traditions, she launched into her assessment of family dynamics. "It's challenging," she told Mrs. Anderson, whose husband ran a major defense subcontracting firm, "when different generations have such different standards. Some people think tradition means doing the same thing, regardless of whether it still makes sense." Mrs. Anderson glanced politely at me. "What kind of traditions?" "Oh, you know, insisting on hosting dinner in outdated kitchens instead of accepting help, refusing to modernize because it's always been done this way, that sort of thing." The conversation had gone quiet at our table, everyone understanding that Jessica was talking about me while pretending to discuss general principles. "Sometimes," Jessica continued, "loving someone means helping them understand that holding on to the past can prevent everyone from embracing the future." That's when she made her fatal mistake. Frank, for instance, still thinks his little workshop and his old truck represent some kind of dignity, as if fixing carburetors is equivalent to building careers. It's sweet, really, but so limited. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Limited. Limited how? I asked quietly. "Oh, Frank, you know what I mean. Your perspective is shaped by a different time, different expectations. There's nothing wrong with that, but it can be frustrating for people who are trying to move forward." Mrs. Anderson shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Taylor, whose firm handled logistics for Navy contracts, had stopped eating entirely. Even the waitstaff seemed to sense the tension. "Moving forward to what?" I asked. "To opportunities that match our potential instead of our past. To social circles that elevate us instead of accommodating us, to futures that reflect achievement instead of just endurance. She was in full swing now, confident she was among people who would understand her sophisticated analysis of family dynamics. The wine had loosened her tongue, and the audience had encouraged her performance. Take Tommy's career, for example. He's incredibly talented, but sometimes family situations can create complications. When your colleagues start forming impressions about your background, your support system, your family's capacity to contribute to rather than detract from your professional image. Tommy's face had gone pale. Jess, maybe we should... No, Tommy, this is important. These people understand what I'm talking about. They know that success requires making difficult choices about priorities. She turned back to the table, her voice carrying to nearby diners. Sometimes you have to choose between what's comfortable and what's constructive, between sentiment and strategy, between maintaining outdated arrangements and creating space for growth. The dining room had grown noticeably quieter. Conversations at other tables had paused as Jessica's voice carried her assessment of my limitations to a growing audience. Frank's a good man, she concluded, but good isn't always enough. Sometimes families need to make hard decisions about what serves everyone's best interests. That's when Colonel Hayes stood up. She walked over to our table with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, her husband following a step behind. The entire dining room watched as she approached. This wasn't casual socializing. This was official movement. "Excuse me," Colonel Hayes said, her voice carrying the authority of 20 years in military leadership. "I couldn't help but overhear. Are you talking about Frank Morrison?" Jessica's face lit up with opportunity. "Yes, Colonel Hayes, actually we are. I'm Jessica Wilson, Tommy's wife. We've been hoping to meet you." "And you are?" the colonel asked, turning to me. The moment stretched like a held breath. The entire dining room was watching now, sensing something significant about to happen. Jessica beamed, expecting some polite acknowledgement that would validate her networking instincts. I stood up slowly, the way you do when military protocol kicks in after 40 years. "Good evening, Colonel," I said simply. What happened next changed everything Jessica thought she understood about power, position, and who exactly was limited in this family. Colonel Hayes's face transformed the moment she heard my voice. The polite smile disappeared, replaced by something Jessica didn't recognize, professional respect. "Mr. Morrison," Colonel Hayes said, her tone shifting to formal acknowledgement. "I didn't realize you'd be here tonight. How are the Alpha 779 specifications coming along?" The dining room had gone completely quiet. Jessica's confident smile wavered as she tried to process why a Pentagon colonel was discussing specifications with her limited father-in-law. "On schedule, Colonel," I replied. "Preliminary designs will be ready by January 10th, as discussed." "Outstanding." The Defense Secretary was hoping to accelerate the timeline, but I assured him that your team delivers quality ahead of schedule. Jessica's mouth opened slightly. "Team? Defense Secretary?" Colonel Hayes turned to her husband. "Robert, I'd like you to meet Frank Morrison. He's the Morrison behind Morrison Defense Solutions, the vehicle armor innovations I was telling you about." Robert Hayes extended his hand with obvious respect. "Mr. Morrison, it's an honor. Your work has saved countless lives in theater. The blast-resistant composites alone have revolutionized how we approach vehicle protection." "Just doing my part," I said simply. But Colonel Hayes wasn't finished. "Frank, modest as always. Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the increasingly attentive dining room, "you're in the presence of one of the Pentagon's most valued defense contractors. 18 patents currently in active use across multiple platforms, including the armor systems protecting our troops in hostile environments worldwide." The silence was profound. Jessica's face had gone from confident to confused, to something approaching panic, as the reality of the situation began penetrating her carefully constructed worldview. "Mr. Morrison," Colonel Hayes continued, "I've been meaning to ask, are you still working with Hampton Defense Systems on the new transport vehicle project?" "Through licensing agreements," I confirmed. "They're good people to work with." Tommy's face had gone white. Hampton Defense Systems, his employer, the company he'd worked for 3 years, without ever knowing that his father's patents formed the foundation of their most profitable contracts. Licensing agreements worth how much annually? Robert Hayes asked with professional curiosity. The Hampton contract, specifically? I considered the question. Roughly $150,000 quarterly, not the largest, but steady. Jessica made a small sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a moan. $150,000 quarterly meant $600,000 annually from one contract alone, more than her husband's entire yearly salary, flowing from patents held by the man she'd just publicly dismissed as limited. And the total portfolio? Colonel Hayes asked. All licensing combined? Just over $2 million annually, plus the consulting fees for active projects. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. $2 million annually, plus consulting fees. Mrs. Anderson, who'd been listening to Jessica's assessment of my limitations just minutes before, now stared at me with new understanding. Mr. Taylor, the logistics contractor, was calculating what kind of Pentagon access required personal discussions with defense secretaries. Frank, Colonel Hayes said, I should mention that Admiral Richardson specifically requested your personal oversight on the Next Generation Vehicle Protection Program. Full systems integration, estimated value at $15 million over 3 years. $15 million over 3 years. Jessica's champagne glass trembled in her hand. The woman who'd spent the evening explaining my inadequacies to Virginia Beach's defense establishment was discovering that the inadequate person was her. Will you be able to handle that timeline alongside your current projects? The colonel asked. Shouldn't be a problem. I keep my operations lean. Tommy found his voice barely. Dad, how long has this been going on? Since I retired from active duty in 1998. It seemed wasteful to let all that field experience go unused. 25 years? Tommy's voice cracked slightly. You've been doing this for 25 years? Combat teaches you things you can't learn in engineering school, I explained to the table, though my eyes stayed on Jessica's stunned face. When you've seen vehicles fail under fire, you understand what they need to survive. The Pentagon values that perspective. Colonel Hayes nodded emphatically. Frank's innovations have directly contributed to a 60% reduction in vehicle-related casualties over the past decade. His work isn't just contracted, it's essential. Robert Hayes added, the Morrison armor systems are standard specification across 3 service branches now. There's literally no equivalent technology available from other contractors. Dad, Tommy whispered, why didn't you ever tell me? You never asked, I said simply. Besides, classified work doesn't make for good dinner conversation. Classified? Jessica's voice was barely audible. Colonel Hayes answered before I could. Mr. Morrison holds TS-SCI clearance, top secret with sensitive compartmented information access. He's briefed on projects that won't be publicly acknowledged for another decade. The dining room had become theater, with our table as the stage and Virginia Beach's defense community as the audience. Everyone was processing the same revelation. The quiet man they'd seen at these events for years, the one dismissed as outdated by his own daughter-in-law, was one of the Pentagon's most trusted contractors. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Anderson said carefully, do you work with other local companies besides Hampton Defense? Most of them, actually. Taylor Logistics uses my transport protection designs. Anderson Systems licenses my communication shielding patents. Davis Engineering builds their blast-resistant structures using my specifications. Each name was a revelation. These families, Jessica's desired social circle, were all connected to my work. Their success depended on innovations developed in the workshop Jessica had called embarrassing. The economic impact locally, Robert Hayes mused, must be substantial. I try to keep the work in Virginia Beach when possible. Good for the community, good for the defense infrastructure. What I didn't mention was the employment numbers. Over 400 local jobs directly tied to contracts requiring my patented technologies. Or the fact that Hampton Defense Systems would lose their 3 largest contracts if I decided to license my innovations elsewhere. Jessica sat frozen, her champagne untouched, watching her carefully constructed social campaign collapse in real time. Every criticism she'd made about my outdated perspective My limited understanding, my embarrassing simplicity was being systematically demolished by objective reality. Well, Colonel Hayes said, glancing at her watch, I should let you get back to your family dinner. Frank, pleasure seeing you as always. And congratulations on the Defense Excellence Award. Well deserved. Defense Excellence Award? Tommy asked weakly. Didn't your father mention it? He's receiving the Pentagon's highest civilian honor next month. Recognition for exceptional contribution to national defense through innovative engineering solutions. She shook my hand formally. Mr. Morrison, we'll speak next week about the timeline acceleration. As the colonel and her husband returned to their table, our corner of the dining room remained silent. Jessica stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Tommy looked between us with growing comprehension of what this meant for everything he thought he understood about his family. And I sat quietly, the same way I always had, knowing that real power doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to be real. I waited until Christmas morning to make my call. Tommy, Jessica, and Jake had stayed overnight Christmas Eve, planning to open presents after breakfast. The house felt full of family for the first time in months, though the atmosphere had been strained since the country club revelation. Jessica had barely spoken since we'd returned from the gala. She'd moved through Christmas Eve dinner like a sleepwalker, occasionally glancing at me with something between confusion and fear. The confident woman who'd spent weeks explaining my limitations had discovered she didn't understand the basic facts of her own family. At 0800, while they were still sleeping, I made the first call. Morrison Defense Solutions. Frank speaking. Mr. Morrison, this is David Chen at Hampton Defense Systems. I hope you don't mind me calling Christmas morning, but we have an urgent situation. What's the situation, David? Sir, our legal department just received notification that several of our primary contracts are under review for potential cancellation. Something about licensing compliance and contractor relationships. My supervisors are asking if you have any information about this. I'd worked with David for 12 years. Good engineer, solid family man, caught in the middle of something that wasn't his fault. David, I'll be direct with you. There have been some personal issues affecting my business relationships. Nothing that reflects on your engineering team, but I need to reassess some partnerships. Sir, with respect, if we lose the Morrison licensing agreements, we lose approximately 70% of our current contracts. That's 180 jobs, including my own. I understand the impact, David. Mr. Morrison, is there anything we can do to resolve whatever issues have arisen? Our entire company depends on those licensing agreements. Through the bedroom walls, I could hear stirring upstairs. Jessica's voice, muffled but urgent, talking to Tommy about damage control and fixing this situation. David, the licensing agreements were always contingent on mutual respect and appropriate working relationships. When those conditions aren't met, contract terms require renegotiation. Sir, what specific conditions haven't been met? Professional conduct standards, David. When company employees or their families engage in behavior that reflects poorly on Morrison Defense Solutions, it creates liability issues. There was a long pause. David was smart enough to understand what I wasn't saying directly. Mr. Morrison, are you referring to Tommy Wilson's situation? I'm referring to conduct that demonstrates poor judgment and potential security risks. When someone shows disrespect for classified work and the people who perform it, it raises questions about their reliability. I see. And what would it take to resolve this situation? That depends on whether the conduct is corrected or continues. Understood, sir. I'll communicate this to my supervisors immediately. The second call was to my lawyer. Morrison Residence. Frank, it's Bill Patterson. Merry Christmas. Sorry to call so early, but you said this was time sensitive. It is, Bill. I need you to execute the contingency plan we discussed. The property transfer plan? Are you certain? Certain. I want the house and all associated assets transferred to the family trust by January 2nd. Full documentation, all legal requirements met. Frank, that's going to create some tax implications and family complications. The family complications already exist, Bill. This just clarifies the legal structure. What about the current residence? Jessica and Tommy have been living there part-time, correct? Their resident status ends January 3rd unless specific conditions are met. What conditions? Written acknowledgement of property ownership structure and formal apology for behavior inconsistent with family values. Delivered in person, witnessed, and notarized. Frank, this is pretty aggressive. Bill, I'm 72 years old. I don't have time for gradual lessons about respect. Understood. I'll have the paperwork ready by December 26th. The third call was the hardest one. Frank? It's Margaret at the Veterans Administration. I have the financial assessment you requested. What did you find, Margaret? Well, the good news is that your benefits and Social Security total $3,200 monthly, more than sufficient for independent living. But Frank, are you sure about this decision? Sunset Manor is expensive, and if family relationships deteriorate... Margaret, I'm not going to Sunset Manor. You're not? But your daughter-in-law called twice this week asking about bed availability and your financial capacity for long-term care. That stopped me cold. Jessica had been making arrangements without my knowledge, checking my financial capacity like I was an asset to be managed rather than a person making my own decisions. She called without my authorization? She said she was helping with family planning. Frank, I probably shouldn't have provided financial information, but she claimed to have power of attorney documentation. I never granted anyone power of attorney, Margaret. Then I may have made an error. She was very convincing about having legal authority to access your financial information. Fraud. Jessica had committed fraud by misrepresenting her legal authority to access my private financial records. That changed everything from family dispute to legal violation. Margaret, I need copies of all communications Jessica Wilson has had with your office. I'll send them today, Frank, and I'll flag your file to prevent any further unauthorized access. The footsteps on the stairs told me the family was waking up. Time for the final conversation. When Tommy and Jessica appeared in the kitchen, they found me sitting at the table with 3 envelopes and a pot of fresh coffee. Merry Christmas, I said quietly. Tommy managed a weak smile. Merry Christmas, Dad. Jessica said nothing, her eyes fixed on the envelopes. I have some gifts for you, I continued. Different kind of gifts than usual. I slid the first envelope toward Tommy. That's documentation of your employment situation. Your supervisors called this morning. The second envelope went to Jessica. That's documentation of your unauthorized contact with the Veterans Administration regarding my private financial information. The third envelope stayed in front of me. And this is documentation of the new legal structure for this property. Tommy opened his envelope with shaking hands. Jessica stared at hers like it might explode. The question, I said calmly, is what happens next? Tommy's hands shook as he read the letter from Hampton Defense Systems. Effective immediately, Thomas Wilson is suspended, pending review of family conduct affecting contractor relationships and potential security clearance violations. Report to Human Resources January 3rd for disciplinary hearing. He looked up at me with devastation in his eyes. Dad, they're saying I might lose my security clearance because of family issues? When someone in your family commits fraud to access classified personnel's financial records, it raises questions about household security practices, I explained calmly. Jessica had gone pale reading her own envelope. Fraud? Frank, I was trying to help plan for your care. That's not fraud. Misrepresenting legal authority to access private financial information is fraud, Jessica. The Veterans Administration has copies of your calls claiming power of attorney you don't possess. I never said I had power of attorney. I said I was family. You said you had legal authority to access Frank Morrison's financial records for family planning purposes. Direct quote from their notes. Tommy set down his letter with trembling hands. Jesus, Jess, what were you thinking? I was thinking about your father's welfare, about making sure he had adequate resources for proper care. You were thinking about controlling my resources, I corrected. There's a difference. Jake wandered into the kitchen in his pajamas, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Why is everyone upset on Christmas? Adult conversation, buddy, Tommy said, his voice strained. Why don't you go watch cartoons for a few minutes? After Jake left, Jessica finally opened the third envelope, the property transfer documentation. What is this? She asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. That's the legal structure of this property. As of January 2nd, full ownership transfers to the Morrison Family Trust, with specific residency requirements for family members. Residency requirements? Written acknowledgement of property ownership and formal apology for conduct inconsistent with family values. Witnessed and notarized. Tommy looked between us with growing panic. Dad, what does this mean for our living situation? It means you have a choice, son. You can acknowledge what this family is actually built on and show appropriate respect. Or you can find somewhere else to live. Are you evicting us? I'm clarifying expectations. Same expectations I've always had. Treat family with respect, tell the truth, and don't mistake quiet for weak. Jessica's voice went sharp with desperation. Frank, this is insane. You're destroying Tommy's career over a misunderstanding. I'm not destroying anything, Jessica. I'm responding to choices you made. What choices? The choice to publicly humiliate me at the country club. The choice to commit fraud, accessing my financial records. The choice to treat my home like your personal property. The choice to teach my grandson that disrespect is acceptable if you're educated and ambitious. I never taught Jake anything inappropriate. You taught him that Grandpa Frank talks funny and smells like motor oil and embarrasses the family at nice events. You think 8-year-olds don't remember those lessons? Tommy buried his face in his hands. Dad, how do we fix this? That depends on what you're willing to fix, son. My phone rang before he could answer. The caller ID showed Hampton Defense Systems. Morrison Defense Solutions. Mr. Morrison, this is CEO Patricia Hendricks. I apologize for calling on Christmas morning, but we have a crisis situation that requires immediate attention. What's the situation, Patricia? Sir, our legal team has informed me that Morrison Defense Solutions is considering terminating our licensing agreements. Mr. Morrison, those agreements represent 70% of our current business. We employ 180 families who depend on those contracts. I'm aware of the employment numbers, Patricia. Sir, with respect, what would it take to resolve whatever issues have prompted this review? Through the kitchen window, I could see neighbors starting their Christmas morning routines, normal families having normal holidays, not dealing with the consequences of fraud and disrespect. Patricia, the licensing agreements include conduct clauses regarding professional behavior and security clearance maintenance. When those standards aren't met, contracts require renegotiation. Are you referring to the Tommy Wilson situation? I'm referring to multiple conduct violations that create liability concerns for Morrison Defense Solutions. Mr. Morrison, Tommy Wilson is a good employee. Whatever personal issues exist, they shouldn't affect 179 other families. Then I suggest you help Tommy Wilson understand the consequences of personal choices on professional relationships. What specifically would resolve this situation? Appropriate acknowledgement of contractor relationships and family conduct standards. Demonstrated understanding that professional success depends on personal integrity. I see. And what form would that acknowledgement take? That's between Tommy Wilson and his family, Patricia, but it needs to happen before January 3rd. I ended the call and looked at my son, whose face showed complete understanding of his situation. His career, his colleagues' jobs, his family's financial security, all dependent on decisions he was about to make. Dad, he said quietly, what exactly do you need from us? I need you to decide what kind of man you are, Tommy. Are you the man I raised? Someone who stands up for family and shows respect where it's earned? Or are you someone who lets his wife commit fraud and publicly humiliate his father because it's easier than having difficult conversations? Jessica stood up abruptly. This is emotional blackmail. This is accountability, Jessica, something you've avoided for months while criticizing everyone else's shortcomings. You're using Tommy's career to force compliance with your wounded pride. I'm using natural consequences to demonstrate that actions have results. You wanted Tommy to move up in the world? Well, the world you wanted him to move into doesn't tolerate fraud and disrespect. Tommy looked at his wife with something approaching anger. Jess, why did you call the VA without telling me? Because you would have stopped me. Because it was wrong. Because you're too loyal to see clearly. Frank needs professional care, and someone had to research his financial capacity. Frank is sitting right here, I said mildly, and Frank's financial capacity is none of your business unless Frank makes it your business. You're his family. You're not. You married into this family, which means you earn your place through respect and contribution. You've shown neither. The kitchen went quiet except for Jake's cartoons playing in the living room and the coffee pot finishing its cycle. Normal Christmas morning sounds underlying an abnormal Christmas morning conversation. Tommy finally spoke. What do you need us to do, Dad? I need you to choose, son, your wife's version of family, where older members get managed and discarded when they become inconvenient. Or my version of family, where respect flows both ways and actions have consequences. And if we choose wrong, then you find out what life looks like without the foundation you've been taking for granted. I stood up and poured myself another cup of coffee, giving them time to process their options. You have until January 2nd to decide. After that, the decisions get made for you. On January 2nd, at exactly 10 a.m., Tommy and Jessica arrived at my front door with a notary public. Jessica carried an envelope and wore the expression of someone who'd spent a week discovering that pride was an expensive luxury she couldn't afford. Tommy looked exhausted but determined, the face of a man who'd finally understood the stakes. Dad, Tommy said, we need to talk. Come in. We sat in the living room where I'd hosted 3 generations of family conversations. The notary, a professional woman named Sarah Mitchell, set up her materials on the coffee table where Jake usually did his homework. Before we begin, Tommy said, I need to understand something. Did you really patent the technology that Hampton Defense depends on? 18 patents, son, developed between 1998 and 2015 based on field experience and engineering principles. Your company licenses 6 of them. Why didn't you ever tell me? You never asked what I did for work. You knew I consulted on defense projects, but you never wanted details. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. She'd spent the week learning exactly what those details meant, not just for my bank account, but for every major employer in Virginia Beach's defense sector. Jessica has something she needs to say, Tommy continued. Jessica cleared her throat, her voice formal and carefully controlled. Frank, I owe you an apology for my behavior and my assumptions about your circumstances and contributions to this family. It was a start, but not sufficient. Specifically, I apologize for publicly disparaging your lifestyle and suggesting you were a burden on family resources. I apologize for contacting the Veterans Administration without your permission and misrepresenting my authority to access your private information. And I apologize for treating your home and your hospitality with disrespect. And she took a breath, clearly reaching the hardest part. And I apologize for failing to understand that my actions could affect Tommy's career and other people's employment. I was focused on what I thought was best for our immediate family, without considering the broader consequences. What do you understand now, Jessica? I understand that you've built something significant through your work and your relationships, that your quiet lifestyle doesn't reflect limited resources or limited influence. That respect is earned through character and contribution, not demanded through social position. It was more than I'd expected and less than she owed, but it was honest. Tommy, what do you understand? My son looked me in the eye for the first time in weeks. I understand that I let fear about my career make me a coward about defending my family. I understand that you've been supporting not just our family, but hundreds of other families through your work, while I worried about whether you embarrassed us at social events. He paused, gathering courage for the harder admission. And I understand that I stopped seeing you as my father and started seeing you as a problem to be managed. That's not the man you raised me to be. What kind of man did I raise you to be? Someone who stands up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Someone who judges people by their character instead of their circumstances. Someone who understands that loyalty flows up as well as down. And what will you do differently going forward? I'll remember that family means supporting each other, not managing each other. I'll make sure Jake learns to respect you for who you are and what you've accomplished. Not apologize for family embarrassment that only exists in other people's minds. Tommy handed me a signed document, and I'll live by the family trust requirements, including the annual acknowledgement that this property belongs to you and your values, not our convenience. The notary witnessed their signatures on documents establishing new ground rules: annual written acknowledgement of property ownership, no unauthorized access to my personal information, and most importantly, no public criticism of family members disguised as social sophistication. "There's one more thing," I said after the legal formalities were complete. "What's that, Dad?" "Jake needs to understand what happened here. Age appropriately, but honestly. He needs to know that actions have consequences and that respect isn't negotiable." Jessica nodded. "We'll explain that Grandpa Frank has an important job helping keep soldiers safe, and that families support each other instead of criticizing each other." "And we'll explain that quiet doesn't mean weak," Tommy added. "It usually means strong enough not to need to prove it." After they left, I sat in my workshop, surrounded by tools and memories and the satisfaction of boundaries clearly established. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Hampton Defense Systems, probably confirming that Tommy's employment review had been resolved favorably. Real power, I'd learned, wasn't about punishment. It was about establishing consequences that taught better choices. The workshop door opened, and Jake peered in. "Grandpa Frank, Mom said I can help you fix things now." "What do you want to learn, buddy?" "Everything," he said, climbing onto the stool beside my workbench. "Dad says you're really good at building things." "I am," I said simply. "But the most important thing I build is family. Want to help me with that?" He nodded seriously, and we got to work.